Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Partnering for Success webinar on safety culture in municipalities. Leading today's webinar will be Micah Kahn. Micah has a diverse background rooted in hands-on experience and service. He started out doing residential construction and later served in the U.S. Army. Following his service, he worked as a railroad conductor for 4 years. For the past 7 years, he has been with the Tennessee Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or TOSHA, conducting inspections with the Public Sector Division in East Tennessee. In this session, Micah will discuss the critical common tasks within cities and counties. He will also provide strategies to develop and implement a more effective safety culture while offering valuable leadership insights to inspire meaningful change within your organization. This webinar will be recorded and a link will be distributed to all registered participants. Please feel free to put any questions you may have throughout the presentation in the chat box. And with that, I will pass it off to Micah.
Amber, thank you so much. Bear with me 1 second here. I'm going to look away from my screen to share mine because I want to be looking at the same presentation as everyone else is here. Can we see the screen there? Can anybody let me know if we're having any issues? Some of this is going to kind of be off out of my view here, and Amber's just going to feel free to step in if anybody has an issue or they can't see something. You should be seeing the TOSHA Basic Safety Culture Evaluating Your Safety and Health Plan main screen right now. So raise hands or do something as long as, I guess, if you have an issue. And at any point during this, if you need to raise your hand or shoot something in the chat, Amber's just going to interrupt me and we'll ask questions as they go. I see we got a couple of chats there. I see it popping up. So that's good.
I can see it.
All right. Everything looks good. So perfect. We're going to get started today. I want to thank Public Entity Partners for giving us the opportunity to speak today. And thank you for your time. Thank you for showing up. So one of the things that I'm excited to talk about today is I was telling Amber a little prior to this meeting that we typically don't spend a lot of time talking about things that aren't quite as tangible. And what I mean by that is, if we say something like a regulation, I can point you to a number. I can go through and tell you an interpretation of that number, kind of what it means, what, black and white issues for the most part. And we tend to stick out of those gray areas as often as we can. However, in the day-to-day stuff of going through and talking to people, talking to safety directors, doing inspections, especially on this public side where there's no penalties involved, a lot of it is it's much more team oriented. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today is just kind of evaluating your safety and health culture, really thinking about how you're perceiving safety and the safety program, where you might have some shortcomings, where you might have issues dealing with people. And so we're going to talk a lot today about that type of stuff, things that are not necessarily something you can wrap a bow on and just say, yep, this is the right answer, is what we're doing today. It's going to be more problem solving, but just hopefully you'll come away with some things to think about. Some of the common things that I've seen doing a lot of inspections and investigations, coming off of fatalities, human psychology that kind of comes along with some of these accidents and what happens. So that's essentially where we're going today, and we're going to get to it. If I can get my clicker started here, nice to use. At the beginning here, we will cover some of just the basic things that you would expect to get in one of our presentations. And this right here is just what I'm talking about. So these are the basic TOSHA standards. When I talk about enforcing a standard, we have a general industry standard, which is the 29 CFR 1910, construction standards 1926, going to depend on what work you're doing. You can go look these up. How is TOSHA structured? So essentially within our departments, we have a safety and health compliance. We have a consultation program, which is kind of a hybrid between like what public sector does and what compliance does. Technically, our public sector is also compliance. However, we do a lot more consultative work almost, especially considering there's no penalties assessed. So that's also a free on-site safety program and assessment. So consultation, want to plug them as often as possible. If you have a smaller business, especially anything that's under private compliance and even stuff under public sector, you can request a consultation. They'll come out there for free, and they essentially have the same agreement like public sector does, where you're just saying, hey, if identify issues, you're going to fix those issues. And you can go on our website, tnosha.gov, and find a lot of that information on that. That's where most of that is stored. We do some whistleblower protection, strictly safety related in that regard. And like I said, safety compliance is going to be pretty standard. What you would think of, most people when they think of OSHA, TOSHA is going to think of safety compliance, right? Fall protection, trenching hazards, that kind of thing. We also have health compliance, which is going to be more around chemical overexposures, doing sampling, noise, that kind of thing. In public sector, we handle both of those. Consultation also handles both of these. They will evaluate both sides of that depending on what you have going on at your business. And like I said, those of you who are in the public sector program probably very familiar with how this works. Like I said, I'm out here in East Tennessee. This is that's my customers, I guess you would say, on the east side of the state. And then we have a guy out of Chattanooga, a lady, Miss Bridget out of Nashville that does that. And then Mr. Mitchell Cothran out of West Tennessee that does inspections. And we have a state agency guy that roams around too. And like I said, we do inspections more often, so we're in there at least every 2 years, doing investigations on top of that, and then there's a lot of interaction with our public sector partners. So this gets us into the kind of the meat of what we want to talk about today, which is how do we evaluate your safety culture? All right. So one of the first things that we do, and one of the things we fill out as far as a checklist, you could call it, or a spreadsheet, um, our job as inspectors is to evaluate the safety and health plan. That means a lot of different things, right? So it could mean, do you have the programs? And that's an easy yes or no answer. Or it can get a lot more, in depth with just how much are people actually following these rules that you've laid out for them? How much is the PPE that you're giving them actually being worn? What type of enforcement do you have? What kind of disciplinarian, policies do you have? All of these things intertwined to create this like fabric that is your safety and health plan or culture, however you want to word that. And so we're just going to talk about some things today. I love Mike Rowe. Um, Dirty Jobs, if you're ever familiar with that, it's a great show, but it's a very working class, blue collar type show. And you really get to see, uh, I grew up working that way. You could call that old school. But I appreciate someone that really gets out there and gets after it, but they're also typically the people that you have to watch the closest when it comes to safety. And Mike Rowe, I had listened to a podcast where he brought up talking about how they had this joke on Dirty Jobs called Safety Third. And the story behind it was that, safety first is the very common phrase. Some of you might even use it within your own, programs. And I'm not saying that that's a bad word or a wrong way to say it. However, he brought up a great point, which is, if you look at it from the perspective of if safety's first, sometimes doing the work or not doing the work would be the safest thing. So if we're going to say that safety is the first and highest priority, sometimes it's hard to swallow that because in a lot of jobs, like the easiest thing to do or the safest thing, I guess you would say to do would be to not do the work at all. And sometimes it's just not feasible. Like the work has to get done. So it really comes down to like, how do we do that with an acceptable amount of risk? So they started saying safety third because it was a joke they had running within the crew. But he also brought up another point that I thought was very fascinating. He got to talking about how as the show progressed in its first couple seasons, they didn't have a lot of injuries, but they didn't have any safety personnel either. And as they started adding safety personnel to the job, he felt like in a lot of ways they got complacent because they started feeling like safety was somebody else's job. That I'm no longer responsible for looking out for my own safety or the safety of my crew or the people that I supervise because we have a safety person on staff that's supposed to be looking at that. And so now I can just abandon that responsibility. And that's something that we see quite often, at least identifying that may be happening. The big thing there, some of the key indicators are, like I said, you go out there and talk to somebody about why they're doing a particular job a certain way, and they just haven't really thought through what the worst case scenarios are going to be for that outcome. And I'll get into some examples of that. But that mentality of safety is someone else's job, right? Like that I as the crew leader or I as the individual working on the ground, We have a safety director. I don't do safety. Safety is some training I do every month. It's some, things I go over once a year. It's not ingrained in what we're doing as a culture. Okay. Um, on top of that, we have we talked about that acceptable risk. So the illusion of safety, mantras like safety first, it's only as effective as the priority of the organization. And what I mean by that is that are you paying lip service to it? Um, Something that happens, I've noticed, and I don't want to pick on anybody for having a fatality or having a hospitalization. You can have a very, very good program that takes it incredibly serious and still have an accident happen. However, what I tend to notice in places that I do have to go do investigations, and I'm distinguishing that from inspections, which are typically, nothing's happened, versus an investigation is we've had something happen and now we have to figure out what happened. Um, you tend to find those places at times are probably a higher percentage of we talk about safety, we maybe even have the right programs in our binders, but nobody really knows what's going on in the field. Each department is kind of left to do their own thing. We hope that they're doing the right thing. And this happens for a lot of various reasons. This is not malicious, normally. We'll talk about some examples that are a little more egregious here in a little bit, but for the most part, like I said, it's not something they're intentionally trying to do. It's just something you need to be thinking about. Um, do your employees think through the risk of their current task, or do they think that those safety concerns are supposed to be addressed by someone else? So one of the places I see this pretty often is hard hat rules. A lot of big utilities will just say everybody wears a hard hat at all times. I mean, people walking around in the office personnel office are going to have hard hats on at times. And it's this, employees complain because it's not fair. So there's a blanket rule. Now, that may be okay. That's a very common thing on a construction site, stuff like that, to just blanket rule something. However, sometimes I think when you blanket rule things, people don't understand why they're doing it anymore. And I tend to find deficiencies in wearing that hard hat sometimes with places that have this always wear it rule because people just kind of want to bend or break the rules, especially if it doesn't make sense to them. And then there's times where they really need it and they're just not thinking through why they would have to have it in the first place. So sometimes I like to put the onus on the employee or the set of employees and say, like, you need to think some of this stuff through. However, I would also caveat that with saying, that's an earned trust, right? That you don't just hand the keys over to somebody who you're not, thinking is going to do very well with taking your safety program and doing something good with it. But if they've proven they can be trustworthy, maybe that's a good thing to do is allow them to think through their own problems and make decisions about what types of safety gear they're going to use, how they're going to use it. So that's something to think about. How can we do a job when we ask we don't have the right equipment? So I've worked a couple of accidents around this type of thing where, especially with backhoes, where we're trying to get up high somewhere, we don't have a bucket truck and you go afterwards and you're like, hey, how did you expect them to address this actual task you gave them, knowing that they don't have the right equipment? And there's this kind of pause where it's like, I don't know, I didn't really think about it. It's just a good example of something to think about, especially in emergency type situations, storms. I know that we got some storms blowing through, we got some issues with that, so we want to make sure that we're thinking about these things when stuff is critically important to happen quickly. We still need to think about what our capabilities are, what we can ask people to do and they can accomplish and do safely. So another example of that would be like chaps for chainsaws, right? So I always tell people store your chaps like right on the chainsaw. That makes it impossible to walk out the door without both of them. You'd have to intentionally take the chaps off of there, which is going to be easier to kind of put on the employee for like, hey, why did we not do this? We made this as simple as possible. So something else to think about. Cultures of secrecy. I've seen this quite a bit where we hide stuff, near misses, stuff like that. We don't bring them up. We don't want anybody to know about them. We're embarrassed by a safety finding or something that almost happened. It is absolutely critical to get a good reporting system for near miss accidents. I mean, it's statistically been proven many, many times over that for every so many near misses, you're going to have an accident. So my opinion on that is if you're going to have, let's say, 9 near misses for every one accident, I'm of the mindset that if you investigate all 9 of those like they were accidents, I think you'll drastically reduce those odds of having that one accident out of 10. Just because there's a number of times I go do investigations and we'll be investigating some particular thing that happened. And during the course of interviewing employees, somebody will say, well, that almost happened to me, a year ago, 3 months ago, 2 years ago, whatever it is. it- none of these hazards that are going on in any of these job sites are unique, right? So if something off the wall can happen, but for the most part, somebody else kind of has almost had it happen before. And if you really push into reporting those type of things and not trying to handle them from a disciplinary process, because you're going to discourage anybody from doing that if you immediately discipline them. Although, once again, that's going to have to be a part of your programs and something to think about. But having that open ability to share those type of things and say, hey, we made a mistake here, it almost was bad, what can we do to fix this, what can we do to prevent it in the future, that goes a really long way. So comfort in breaking unnecessary rules. So this happens a lot with utilities, probably less so on the city county side of things, where we go so strict with our rules that we almost know they're being broken every day, or we make a rule so stringent that it's above and beyond rule, and we just know they can't follow it, but we don't want to change the rule. So I'm always recommending, like, make sure your rules make sense. If you know people can't get their job done without breaking the rules, you got to change those rules. You have to make this make sense for people. So some of the concepts we're going to talk about a little bit here are just defining our safety culture, a little bit about leadership and teams, and that's what I was talking about with the human psychology element of understanding you've got different people that you work with different personalities and different ways to get them to row the boat in the direction you want them to. And so I just want to share a couple of stories with that and some things that I've read personally too, that kind of tie in with the military service and that's most of my leadership experience was in the military. And a lot of this translates because I tell people all the time, safety is a people game. There's just no way around it. It's a people game. You have to get people to buy into this. Otherwise, no matter how good your program would be, it can't be run from an office. It's going to have to be run in the field where the work's actually happening, and that only happens with buy-in. So we're going to get into a lot of that stuff. So some different scenarios here of like which would describe your organization. So as you're sitting here listening to this, try to think about which one of these would you think your particular city, county, municipality, whatever it is, what would you think your organization fits into for the most part? So reactive, which would be kind of like a blame culture where we only do something once it's too late, right? And I don't want to say too late, but once something's happened, we don't really worry about anything until it actually becomes a problem. We just wait until there's an issue and then we react to that issue. The compliant organization, meaning we want to be across the board, checking boxes, everything's good to go, but no more. That's it. Like we're going to do bare minimum essentially, and that's all we're going to do. And if you ask anything more than that, we're just not interested. There's active, which aims to recognize good safety practices, right? So that's doing those investigations for near misses. That's incentivizing employees to report issues or wear their PPE, and there's a lot of different ways you can be active. A task force, so that type of organization, maybe, lots of talk about safety. This is another thing that you run into quite often where you go in and you'll get the binders out and man, those programs are just dialed in. That training is documented perfectly and everything looks great. But you go audit a place and it doesn't look like anybody's actually doing it, right? They're kind of, it looks good on paper until you get out in the real world and then it's not quite as good as you'd want it to be. And then there's the fatalistic or pathological. So accidents are out of our control. There's nothing we can do about this. This kind of thing just happens to people. That one's definitely one you want to try to avoid because, from TOSHA's perspective, and this is the way we think about a lot of things, is if we can't learn something when someone dies or is hospitalized, like if nobody can, if there's nothing to learn from this incident, then what are we doing here, right? So the whole point of it is to figure out what can we do differently to stop that from happening again in the future. Um, So many different combinations of culture too. Like I said, if we go back to those ones, you can think about which one you may likely fall into, but inevitably you're going to be a mixture of all those things. It's not, once again, so I was talking about early with, this is not a black and white issue. This is shades of gray all over the place. Okay. So one department may be one way, one department may be another way. And some of these things, if you sit down and think about them and try to identify with what are they, like what are they doing well, what are they doing poorly, and then what can we do to incentivize making progress. So that's kind of the point of what we're talking about today. So who drives this and steers that culture? We're going to talk about that a little bit. Who pays the consequences for failure? And once again, those are kind of a lot of people in both cases. And physical and mental consequences, I'll touch on that just really quickly. So almost every time that I do a fatality, matter of fact, every fatality investigation I've ever done, there is always somebody else who either retires or quits, or sometimes is fired, depending on what's going on. But the point being that whenever you have an accident that severe, you're going to lose more than just whoever was actually injured or killed. There's almost always someone else involved who just can't live with what they've done, especially if it's a fatality or especially if they feel like they could have prevented it in some way. So that mental side of things that we don't talk about too often is definitely a real piece of this and something to think about. And then we're going to talk about ways that we could possibly shift our safety culture and think about things in a little different manner. So this is kind of the ways that I think about the pillars of safety culture, if you want to say it that way. Um, you have to have all of these things or a combination of most of them. In an ideal world, you'd have every single one of them. But if you start reading these, you're going to realize that it's hard to put, like, do we have employee buy-in? That's not a check the box thing, right? That's not a yes or no answer. Do you have most employees buy-in? That's what you're striving for. Is like, how many people can we get to own up? And I'll talk about that piece in just a second. But for the most part, you can't have anything without that very top piece. The management commitment to safety is important because one, you have to support the rule structure that you've set forth, and two, you have to financially support it. PPE costs money. Allowing people to take the time they need to do the work safely costs time and money. So we have to have that management commitment. Nothing else will work. It does not matter how much the employees at the bottom want to be safe. If management doesn't buy in, there's no way to do this any other way. Okay. So same thing can be said in the opposite direction. We can have management completely committed to safety and employees not buying in. Now, I would argue over time that will inevitably change because management is going to put the people in positions of authority that will commit to safety like they view safety. So a lot of times that's a matter of time before it falls in line, but it's something that you need to think about. Employee buy-in is crucial because you can have all the rules and programs you want. If they ignore it when they go in the field and nobody's checking on what's going on out there, you're just kind of asking for it. So open communication throughout the organization, always very important. When things get siloed, we miss the near misses, we miss the accidents, we miss the things that almost happen. We miss the intention of some rule. We got to change gloves for some reason and there's not good communication on why, and then people are just confused. In an ideal world, we want employee ownership of the culture. So if you can get your culture to be driven by the employees and management just supports it, those really seem to be programs that excel, from what I've seen. And then you want participation across the organization. So we want to make sure if you don't have a safety committee, I'd highly recommend starting one. We'll talk here in a minute about different personalities of people. One of the things I suggest constantly is if you have those one or two employees that just think everything is stupid when it comes to safety, put them randomly on safety committees. Let them be a part of choosing what PPE they wear. It's a lot easier to complain about something that's someone else's decision. When you have to do it, it's a little less fun to complain about. So just food for thought there. So today I'm going to talk about executive level leadership predominantly, more so than employee and frontline supervisor, just because I think on this call, I probably have more executive type level within your organizations. Main things we want to focus on: setting a tone, having clear expectations. And once again, this is all coming from a safety perspective, but a lot of this just comes down to work in general. accountability, some kind of disciplinary process. What happens if you do break the rules? What happens if you're not following, what we want you to do? Is everybody know that it's just a wink, wink, nod, nod situation where we don't really have to worry about it? Or is this something they take serious and I've got to worry about losing my job? So that's where accountability comes in. Resources, what kind of, equipment, what's the condition of the equipment that you give? What are your PPE, requirements? Can we get gloves, once every 6 months, or can I get them as I need them? So that all just falls into what are the resources available to employees for what they need. Recognition and rewards. A little pat on the back goes a long way. I've got a safety director for a utility who loves to bring up the old Theodore Roosevelt quote of no one cares what you think until they know how much you care. Um, and when you and I'm sorry, I butchered that one just a little bit there, but you get the sentiment of the quote, which is essentially that you really do have to care about your people. It's going to be very difficult, and they will see right through if you're only doing this for your own benefit or to check some box. But if people feel like they're actually, hey, my company cares whether I show up, they care whether or not I go home fully intact at the end of the day, it, that's a culture within itself, right? So just something to think about. You really have to care about your people going home. And sometimes people do care about that, but they don't really feel that, or they wouldn't admit to that until something happens, and then they really feel how much they care and how much responsibility they feel towards those individuals. And I just would rather you learn that lesson in a way that's not having to go through something as terrible as going through a fatality investigation. So once again, just food for thought there. Oh, there you go. There's the quote. So if I butchered it a little bit, I got it close. It is a great quote, though. So what we want to do, create that buy-in. Your priorities are going to be acknowledged, even if they're nonverbal. So like I said, if you get up in front of everybody and tell them like safety is the most important thing out there, and then they see you out there doing things that are not quite safe or breaking rules here and there, and everything's just done with this little, you know what I mean, when you do that, you're opening yourself up for everybody else feeling like that's the culture. That's how things go around here, and it's fine. Nobody's going to say anything. And I deal with quite a few places that are like that. Sometimes it's just a department within a very good, you know, safety conscious town, but one department kind of acts rogue. So just know what your teams are doing and understand what they're kind of up against. Um, Spend a lot of time with your safety training on those frontline supervisors. They're where the rubber meets the road. If they're going to be the management liaison, like we view a frontline supervisor being out there at a job site the same way as if the mayor's standing there next to you, right? It's their job to make sure that the stuff that the city wants done, the town wants done, the rules they want enforced are actually enforced. So train those frontline supervisors, know that you have, if they know that you have their backs, they're very likely to go out there and actually execute on things that you want done and in a proper manner. Fault, be careful with finger pointing. Okay. It happens every time we have a hospitalization or a fatality. Once again, and even sometimes just on a normal inspection, you find something and immediately people, well, it was so and so. I'm not interested. That's not my job to go out there and find whose fault, right? Once again, it's what do we learn from this? That's more the goal. Like what's the root cause of what happened? How do we stop it from happening again? Sometimes there are people who are clearly at fault, but it doesn't take me or anybody else to need to tell them that. People feel guilty about things enough on their own. So if you got a fault culture where you're doing a lot of blaming other people, really think about that. And then leading by example. Once again, if you're going to tell people to follow rules, you need to make sure you're doing that. And like I said, training, we want to train those frontline supervisors to know the expectation, they know their team, and then they go out and execute. Okay. Um, Different personalities. So this comes up quite often. Like I said, I've got several safety directors who have reached out at random times and they've said, hey, we've got these problems. This individual won't get on board. I don't want to fire them because they're a water treatment operator and those don't grow on trees, right? I a lot on the electric utility side. I got a lineman like that we can't just fire them, and sometimes my response to that is I'd rather them be fired than dead. But that depends on how extreme the situation is. So one of the things to think about here, like I said, you got leaders. Sometimes those leaders are in positions of authority and sometimes they're not. Some people are just have leadership principles. I'm an oldest child and I tend to like to boss people around, tell them what to do, no matter whose team I'm on. So that just happens. You got mediators, experts, and the experts time, that theme, that one specifically tends to be people who think that some rules are very stupid. If they think that they know and understand the process better than everybody else, they may think a particular rule is stupid. And so you got to figure out how to get that buy-in. And then everybody's familiar with the naysayers. Nothing's ever good enough. Nothing's ever right. Nothing's, their fault typically. And so there's a lot of different people out there. The big one to watch is the wild card. The wild card is a person who comes up with great ideas, they get stuff done, and you don't even really want to, you feel like you almost don't want to ask how that got done, right? It's like, I need something done, and then all of a sudden, an hour later, like, yeah, it's done. You're like, that should have taken all day. I don't understand how that's done already. Whatever, I'm just going to not worry about it. Watch out for those wild cards. They have a good tendency to get work done, but you need to really pay attention to how they're doing it. So, understanding these strengths and weaknesses of everybody. And like I said, this is incredibly generic, and most people are going to fall into like multiple middle ground categories or have a little tendency of one and another. But charts like this or thinking about these type of individuals really help. It goes a long way in thinking about how do we get the performance that we need from them, right? So if a leader wants to be in charge, get them in charge sometimes, right? And if they fail at something, kind of coach them through what they failed. Also, it's very good to take leaders and make them not in charge. So put somebody who, an expert per se, or even the naysayer, every once in a while, put them in charge and just let that leader, they've got to learn to be a team player too, like everybody else. So you can mix and match these ideas and think about kind of building this team within a team. And so there's just a lot of strategies about how to do it. So when we're talking about leaders and communication, whether this be the top down, management to the bottom, um, you got to make sure that your attitude is where it needs to be. One of the old military sayings, like, and this is something that I don't see a ton in normal business per se, but I think it's very valuable in the military, and there's a reason for it, is that you don't complain to people below you. Not that you don't want to be real with people, and there were times for sure in the military where you're sitting there and you're like, guys, this is just it's a terrible situation. There's no way to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. I can at least admit that. But if I have some particular, thing that I'm upset about from I didn't like this mission, I didn't like how we had to do something that we, were made to do, there's a lot of times where I'm just going to internalize that. And when I bring up those issues, I'm going to bring them up to my boss because complaining about it down, complaining it to my employees is going to create rifts, right? And you get these teams that it's us versus them, and you get this, lower level employee versus management type thing going on. And you need to be very careful about that. That's a tricky situation to kind of thread that needle. Um, it's always the leadership's responsibility for good communication, right? You can't blame that on employees. If you don't communicate well your expectations to them and what their rules are and what their procedures should be, you can't be surprised when they don't communicate to each other and nobody seems to know what's going on. Um, a lot of times, failure to adequately communicate in some way leads to a fatality or a hospitalization. We had a situation at a substation one time that comes directly to mind where originally we were supposed to do work in this one particular area of a substation and everything in that area was going to be dead. And then they found a hot spot, which is, essentially just an area that's getting overheated. It's a little further outside of the original scope of the project. And we just like, oh, if we just shut this one thing off over here and ground, we're good to go. And we can now do and execute that work in a safe manner. But there was some backfeeding issues. Another part of the substation was backfeeding, and the the people at the top were aware this was a possibility, but they didn't worry about it because they would have had to get another utility involved, and they didn't think they'd be in the area. So it wasn't malicious and it wasn't lazy. This is a 200 step switching order. So this took 3 days to even get, to a point where we could do this work. 200 steps and you miss one, right? So the in that industry specifically, the margin of error is like incredibly tiny. But that was just a bad communication. Like it's miscommunication. It led to a hospitalization, luckily not a fatality, but that's just how important it can be to make sure we're really going through and you know, communicating well with others. And like I said, your frontline supervisor are really going to feel that responsibility if something happens to their people. A lot of times it's them that kind of quits, retires, leaves after that fact. So think in your head real quick. If I got employee one's got a large ego, they think they're correct about everything. Everyone else's ideas are stupid. They like to undermine authority. You got an employee two here. They lack confidence. They don't have any self-esteem. They don't speak up with concerns. They don't speak up for themselves. One of the ways that you could fix these are two separate issues, two separate individuals. And I would argue you could fix a lot of these issues with the same thing. Put them in charge of something, whatever it is. It doesn't have to be anything major. It can be a small project. Put them in charge of something. And you start to realize when you complain about a lot of things, you put those shoes back on, you know, the other feet, doing what your boss does day in and day out. Maybe there's not as much to complain about. Um, this is something too that we, from a leadership perspective, something always good to think about. There's a book, Jocko Willink and Babin. They talk about this book's called Extreme Ownership, and they illustrate a story in here talking about a boat race. And I'm not going to read this verbatim, but it's all in here. The the essential part of the boat race is understanding that this is during SEAL teams, BUDS training, and they have different rowboats that go around and they're racing each other, right? And they had a boat that was coming in dead last every time. These people are all exhausted, you know, they're being worked to the bone, you know, sleep deprivation, all those things. And the leaders typically in those classes are going to be officers in the future, right? So if I have an officer that comes in and takes that course, we're going to put them in charge of things because we want to know if they can handle being in charge. So they had essentially a low performing boat. Um, six leader, like I said, this is the one that's not performing well. He just doesn't care. He thinks he's got a terrible team. That's why they're coming in last. It's not him. They have another team that they're winning every single one of them. That boat crew two, that leader there, they're winning every single one. So they flip flop them, and they take the leader from the highest performing group and they move them to the lowest performing group, and then they take the lowest performing leader and they move them to the highest performing group. And if you want to know, considering this is a story in a book somewhere, probably going to have an unexpected twist to an ending, but maybe something you can anticipate. Under the new leadership, that boat crew six, they the worst performing one all of a sudden starts to believe that they can win because you just get someone in there that's different, that believes in you, that coaches you in the right way, that says the right things, that motivates you in the right way. All of a sudden they start winning. Now boat crew six with the new, I guess you could call worse leader, even though I wouldn't say that. I would just say less trained leader. Um, they still perform well. That team was already operating off the leadership that they were used to. So sometimes you're going to get employees that, you know, have had good leadership in the past, exhibit some of those good characteristics, and vice versa. You're going to get people as frontline supervisors that were treated very poorly in their past, and they're going to treat their people that way. And all this is relative because if you tie this in, leadership and safety, they just all go hand in hand, right? If I go through and I'm not getting you to understand why I need you to do things and I can't get even basic work performance out of you, well, then I'm not going to be able to get you to follow the rules that we've set for you either. So, as leaders, what I would challenge everybody, you know, that's a leader in any sense within an organization, and even if you're just a frontline employee, you have leadership capabilities too, and you can be an example for people. But what's your attitude say about how you feel about showing up to work every day? So just something to think about, you know, places that people seem to really like each other and enjoy being there, they look out for each other. They won't let other people do stupid things because they'll tell them, like, I don't want to tell your family that, you know, I could have prevented that and I didn't because I know your kids, I know your spouse. Those tight connections are really good and they're harder to kind of coalesce as the bigger your organization gets. So if you're from a really big county, really big city, you're going to have difficulty getting that to work just properly. But it can be done. You might not know every single individual on a personal level, but within departments, you can also foster that type of culture. So that's pretty much all I have. I know it's a lot of stuff thrown at you and a lot of different considerations, but do we have any questions? Do we have anything like that that we'd like to throw out there any particular scenarios that you've come into contact with or addressed or anything like that? I don't know how long I should let the awkward silence be. I'll let Amber decide that. You might be typing in your chat, so we don't want to rush out of here too quickly.
Right, I'll give him another minute.
Well, I'll plug this really quickly. Um, this is the Safety and Health Conference that we do every year in Nashville. TOSHA sponsors and a part of this every year, have been doing it as long as I've known. It's next week, actually, so I'm probably a little late to sign up if you didn't get in on it this year. But it changes. It's usually between springtime and late summer. There's a website right there. You can sign up for notifications, but it's a great place to go if just to network with other safety people. There's usually some really good classes that are all offered there. And the vendor area is also really, really good. There's a lot of vendors they'll have come in, and every year I like to walk through there and just see what's new. What else is out there that didn't exist before from a safety perspective. So I'd encourage anyone who does safety, if you can get to one of these conferences, it's well worth your time. And there's some little information about the website and everything. But that's all I have.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Micah. And if there are no questions, then we hope to see you in our next Partnering for Success webinar. That will be on June 25th, and it's going to be over building awareness to prevent EPLI claims. And more details will be available in this month's edition of Partners News. And we also wanted to remind everyone about the incoming inclement weather. We sent out an email yesterday with guidelines on how to prepare for flooding, as well as how to file claims in our online portal system. But with that, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day and hope to see you next time. And I hope everyone stays safe and dry. So, see ya.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.